So, you guys know who Lori is, and you've got the bio and things. And there's, all of you, except DJ, have been subjected to my Minnesota exceptionalism, and the fact that I sort of believe that in this state we have we do it better than anybody else, even though we don't do it perfectly. We just somehow get a little more around the subject of policy formulation. We get a little more around feeling good for everybody, you know, focusing on this kind of stuff that needs to happen. And that's to me, that's a function of the people who make that system work, and this is one of those people who makes it still tenable for a person in political life in the state of Minnesota to actually care about real stuff, as opposed to what we seem to be doing nationally, which is screaming at each other and, you know, that kind of thing. That, I just am always honored when I get to talk to her, and we get to do that once in a while. We have a group of folks who meet at various houses, usually hers, to have wonderfully prepared meals and just go over the entire universe, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And this book is one of her 9? No.
We're up to 10.
10.
We're up to 10, yeah.
10 books about, so she's, as you guys know, I also brag a lot about the fact that I'm the ultimate font of wisdom on Minnesota history, but actually she knows more about it, which is, I'm willing to admit that. Yeah, I'm willing. So thanks much, Lori.
Oh, thank you, Y. You know, I'm part of the Y Spano fan club, and we could spend the rest of the morning exchanging compliments. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be here kind of on short notice, actually. We have the kind of friendship where Y, having some difficulties at home, said, gee, could you come? And I was glad to say yes. So glad to be here and to share with you some conversation this morning about gender equity in Minnesota. I wrote a book about that has the history of what I consider to be this, what I think historians, not just me, consider to be the second wave of the women's movement in this country and how it applied to Minnesota. And it challenged me to talk about what is the definition of gender equity, and what I would tell you is that that's a definition that has changed through the years and through the waves of the women's movement. The first wave was suffrage. 1848, Seneca Falls, through 1920, the enactment of the 19th Amendment. And gender equity in that period would have been defined in terms of citizenship, equal opportunity to participate in the governance of this country through the vote, through the ability to run for office. In Minnesota, as soon as that happens in 1920, 8 women run for the Minnesota House, 4 are elected. It looks like women are off to the races. But the next year, 2 of them were defeated. And for 50 years thereafter, in the Minnesota legislature, there are 2 women, 1 woman, occasionally a third one. In the Minnesota Senate, there's 1 woman who was a widow of someone who had died in office, and it was kind of customary sometimes for the widow to then take that seat. That's how that happened. But it was sort of this long period between the first wave and the second wave. Then comes the second wave. It comes out of the civil rights movement. It comes out of the anti-war movement. It comes out of sort of a generational shift, as the generation that spawned and raised the baby boomers is, those young people are finally about to enter the workforce, entering their college years and the workforce. And those women are looking around and saying, we got to help pay for the college for these kids, but also, what else? This was a well-educated generation that had tasted some professional freedom just a little bit during World War II, many of them. And they were eager for more. And so in that second wave, that's the wave we're going to talk about mostly today with this book I wrote. The second wave, generational equity was mostly defined in occupational terms. Breaking glass ceilings, opening professional doors that had been closed to women. When my mother's generation, Rosalie's generation, came of age, there weren't very many professional opportunities for women. You could be a secretary, you could be a nurse, you could be a teacher. A couple of other fields were open to you, but that was kind of about it. And that changed explosively during the period that begins about 1968, 69, and into the next 20 years or so. We'll talk today about some of those changes. Gender equity was defined then about how do women have more opportunities professionally, career-wise. There were other goals too, and many of those other goals, I think, are the unfinished business of the second wave and are the seeds for a third wave. See, that music mixing terribly, my metaphor is terribly here. But are the impetus, shall we say, for a third wave, which I think is coming and may even already be here. And that has to do with, the third wave, I think, will be about changing the institutions so that we adapt our structures, our patterns in society to a reality of shared responsibilities of adulthood across gender lines. We can talk more about that as we go, but let's go through my slides here. These are slides I often use when I just describe this book that came out in 2014. I'm pleased to say it won a Minnesota Book Award, and it's been getting a continued good reception after all this time. People are very interested in this story. So let me introduce you to Rosalie Wahl. I love this picture. We use this picture on the cover of the book. I love this larger picture, which includes her Bar Association's certificate on the wall. That was omitted from the cover, but you'll notice that the certificate reads Mrs. Rosalie Wahl. It wouldn't read that way today, but that was what such a certificate would have looked like in the 1970s. It shows, that picture right by itself shows that there was a change. Rosalie Wahl could be seen as a pioneer and a solo figure. And in the study of history that many of us were exposed to in our youth, we sort of studied the great men of American history, Washington, Jefferson, Ben Franklin. Some folks want to study the women's movement that way, and I counsel against it, because the women's movement was much more of a grassroots thing that encompassed a whole lot of people kind of all at once. Gail Collins wrote a book called When Everything Changed, and she tries to explain how this isn't a movement to be understood through the energies of a few great people, a few great women, though there were certainly women who applied themselves in heroic ways, and I think Rosalie is on that list. But this was not something that they produced. This was a groundswell across lots of sectors in our society. And Rosalie, I would say Rosalie Wahl rode the wave of the women's movement, that second wave, and then when she had the chance to accelerate it, she did. This is a little bit about her. She was born Sarah Rosalie Irwin 4 years after suffrage was enacted in Gordon, Kansas. Her father was an oil jobber, a kind of fellow who moved around a lot. She was the third child in a family of four. And the family was, if it had any stability at all, it came through her mother's family. Her mother was the eldest of 6 children, the daughter of some farmers. And when the mother died, when Rosalie was just not quite 4 years old, the family broke up, and it was decided that the older daughters would stay with their father, and the younger 2 children, Rosalie and her little brother Billy, were to go live with Grandpa and Grandma. That all seemed to be working pretty well until in a terrible, tragic accident in May of 1932 happened right in front of Rosalie's eyes. A speeding train came around a blind curve at a time when it shouldn't have been there. No whistle was sounded. The train was completely behaving illegally. The train smacks into the wagon that carried Grandpa and little Billy and killed them both. They found the little boy's body in the cow catcher of the train. That's how fast it was going. Rosalie then winds up being raised by her maternal grandmother, all just the 2 of them in a little stone house with relying heavily on the charity of an extended family. And she grew up hearing complaints and laments about the lack of justice for the death of Grandpa and Billy. The train was functioning illegally, but there was no willingness on the part of anybody in that rural Kansas area to prosecute the train, the railroad, for what had happened. The family said, well, certainly we could pursue a civil judgment against the railroad, and they went to a lawyer in Caney, Kansas, and he said, well, if you could put $100 up front, we'd take the case. In that time, in 1932, farmers in the Midwest didn't have $100. It might as well have been $100,000. This family was left with no recompense. A year later, the same railroad threw off a spark on a dry field and caught a farmer's field on fire just before harvest. And the railroad put up $25 for that loss. And Rosalie would hear her grandmother complain, you mean the loss of a crop is worth $25, but the loss of 2 lives doesn't merit any justice. Rosalie was a bright girl, and she graduated from high school in 1942, another time of great change and ferment in this country, with World War II having just begun. And she's got a sweetheart named Eldon Peck, who she met at Methodist Youth Fellowship in little Caney, Kansas, and she goes off to the University of Kansas to study journalism. But the war is distracting her, and so is young love, and she winds up thinking, no, the summer of 1943, I'll do what many young women did, what my own mother did, and that's to take a 5 or 6 week course to learn to be a rural country school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. She went back to the very same school she had attended as a girl, while her fiancé was in training in, I believe, South Carolina, in the service. He was, I believe, in the Air Force Reserve. And in November of 1943, he is seriously injured in a training accident. Rosalie rushes to his side, but does not get there in time, and Eldon Peck died. Rosalie said if the Methodist Church had had a convent, she would have joined it. But she was in the company of family and friends and was able to get through that period, dark period, and return the next fall of 43, I believe it was fall of 44 by then, to the University of Kansas, returns as a sociology major this time, thinking she would be a social worker. And those next few years is when she gets that taste that so many American women did during World War II of opportunity, of professional opportunity. She was the editor of the newspaper on campus, or was it the yearbook? I have to check my notes here. She edited the student newspaper, a role that probably would have been held by a male student had there been more males on campus. She was the head of the YWCA, and at that period did some pioneering racial integration of the house that was owned there. It allowed her to have some strong personal friendships across race lines that she might not have had otherwise growing up in rural Kansas, and gave her a real taste of leadership. She was sent off to New York City in the summer of 1945 to attend a YWCA leadership training camp that was really an important experience for her. She switches to the Quaker faith at this point through the influence of some adults that she had met through the Y and through her academic experiences, and it winds up through Quaker connections becoming in the orbit of a fellow named Rosalie Wahl, the son of the University of Kansas medical school dean, who comes back from the war in fall of 1945, having been pretty badly scarred by the Battle of the Bulge, which he had been in the year before. Having seen an awful lot of death and trauma and having experienced some himself. Ross came back interested in the peace movement, and the two of them are married in August of 1946 and pursue the notion of new living arrangements. Rosalie called it a Yeasty time. Those were Yeasty days, times when a lot of the world after World War II settles down, gets married, and starts thinking about how they could make the world better. It was that impulse that brought them to Minnesota. They moved here in December of cold winter of 1949 with a little baby in tow, the first of their 5 children. The notion was to come to Circle Pines, which is a northern suburb that has an unusual history among our suburban communities. It was founded to be a kind of an intentional community, a Quaker utopian village, you might say, with a socialist or even communist orientation. That appealed to the Walls at that point. They came with other couples, and the notion was that they would live together in some communal arrangement. They would share a lot of the obligations of child rearing and earning a living. All of that experimenting lasted for, about 10 years in various permutations. It failed, as you might expect it ultimately would. It was hard on the men when it failed, but not less so, I think, on the women. Rosalie actually said, just because something fails doesn't mean it didn't have value. And she felt that, especially through the sharing of the obligations of child rearing, that she and the other women involved had some good experiences. Well, by the early 1960s, Rosalie sees a couple of things pretty clearly. She sees that she's going to have to help to pay for the education of, by then, 4 children. And she was going to have to be prepared to support herself because her husband's instability, mental health issues coming out of the war were only getting worse. We call it PTSD today, post-traumatic stress disorder. There was no such good diagnosis in those years. But Rosalie Wahl was among the many people who came out of war scarred. That marriage was in trouble, but she has his blessing to go to law school. On a part-time basis. William Mitchell College of Law then only served part-time students. And it was a good place for her to land, even though she was one of only 2 women in her law school class. While she was there, among the many moments in her life that gave me pause, that sort of stuck with me, was the moment in the fall of 1963 when Rosalie, aged 39, goes to the dean of the law school, then age 29, believe it or not, Doug Heidenreich, still around, fellow's still around. Actually, I'm a pretty good friend of his ex-wife at my church. Doug and Rosalie's story, I heard it from both of them, and the stories match. She came in to say, I need to cut back my course load next semester and only take 1 class rather than what was the usual load then. Why would you want to do such a thing? Well, I'm pregnant. Well, he might have said congratulations or best wishes or some of the polite things you're supposed to say upon receiving that news, but instead, after saying something like that, he proceeded to scold her for being pregnant and scold her for thinking that she should cut back on the courses, knowing that if she lost the sequence of classes, she would wind up being in law school longer or have real trouble getting the material she needed to pass the bar. And she kept her cool and allowed that at age 39 and having her 5th child, she knew what this entailed, and that she would please stick with the plan and cut back. And he finally signed off on that change. He had already registered for classes, and she needed his signature to withdraw from some classes. She wound up only missing 1 week of classes because of the birth of little Jenny, who you see here in the pigtails beneath her mom. And Doug Heidenreich was so impressed with Rosalie that he became one of her great fans and boosters. He wound up giving her, through independent study, the class that she was missing so she could take the bar in a timely fashion. And just a few years later, he hired her to lead the Mitchell College of Law first criminal clinical program. I always have to slow down when I say that because those are hard words to say at once. Criminal law clinical program at Mitchell College. Mitchell became a national pioneer in the clinical programs that allowed law students to actually have practical experience. It's the legal version of practice teaching. She was a real national leader in that movement, so much so that she becomes very active in the accreditation of law schools through the American Bar Association. Toward the end of her career, she heads the ABA Accreditation Committee and heads several important commissions pushing for the reformation of law school curricula to include more practical experience. That's a movement that continues, and Rosalie was important in it. Well, by the time Rosalie is at William Mitchell, a real movement has arrived in Minnesota, a feminist movement. And I've put up this sort of yearbook slide because these are some of the people I think about. When I think about Minnesota's women's movement, they were heroes and friends of mine, all of them. Some of them are still with us and some of them are gone. And I'll just go through their names here, starting up in the upper left-hand corner. That's Nancy Bradis. I had mentioned earlier that the Minnesota Senate had in the 1930s a woman who was a widow who took her husband's state Senate seat upon his death. Nancy was the first woman elected in her own right in Rochester in 1975 in a special election. She was a Republican, she was pro-choice, She was a real groundbreaker and someone who always considered herself a feminist. Next to Nancy is Joan Grow, Minnesota's Secretary of State for 24 years. First woman elected, again, in her own right, not a widow, to statewide office in Minnesota. There had been a widow Secretary of State before, she called herself Mrs. Mike, whatever her name was. She never used her own name on the ballot. Joan was elected in 1972 to the Minnesota House. There had been, I mentioned to you, all these years of only 1 or 2 women in the Minnesota legislature. But there was a real wave beginning in the late 1960s, early 1970s to increase women's opportunities in the political realm. Consciousness-raising groups all over the state being led by the budding National Organization for Women, the budding Minnesota Women's Political Caucus, which was a bipartisan organization. In 1972, we had a surge in women running for office and 6 women elected to the Minnesota House. Joan was one of them. One of those women who was leading that push is right next to Joan. That's a young picture of Arvon Fraser. Arvon is part of that group of friends that get together that I described as he was introducing me. Arvon's a good friend of mine, and she and I wrote a book together a few years ago. Arvon was a real national leader, head of the national the Women's Equity Action League, which was sort of the legal arm of the women's movement. She did that while she was living in Washington as Don Fraser, the congressman's wife. She wound up working twice for the U.S. State Department, a real national leader still, and an international leader in women's rights and women's opportunities. Next to Arvon is Emily Ann Staples. She was the first DFL woman elected to the Senate in 1976, and I put her picture up because she represents some of the changes that happened in the 1970s. She had been an active Republican. She was somebody who wanted to be a lawyer, and her dad talked her out of it in the 1950s. That happened to a lot of women. But she stayed active in civic affairs as a Republican and was on the Republican State Platform Committee in 1972 when, to her great dismay and disappointment, the party backed off its previous support for the Equal Rights Amendment. And she left the party and ran for the legislature unsuccessfully as a DFLer in 1974 and then successfully for the state senate in 1976. She was one of a number of feminist women who increasingly found the Republican Party not to be a congenial home. But there was, in that early period, a good deal of bipartisanship around the women's movement. Underneath Emily Ann is Marlene Johnson. She was the first female lieutenant governor of Minnesota, Rudy Perpich's choice in 1982. But before that, she had been one of the real leaders in founding a couple of institutions that are still with us. The Minnesota Women's Political Caucus, which is not so active anymore, gave birth to the Minnesota Women's Campaign Fund, now called Women Winning. It's still the only organization of its kind at the state level in the country to really give a boost to pro-choice women candidates across party lines if they can find Republican pro-choicers, which is difficult now. But that was the original impulse, was that this was a bipartisan but markedly feminist organization. Marlene is now the head of something called NAFSA, which is an acronym that doesn't mean what it used to, but it's the National Association that looks at of foreign exchange educators around the country and based in Washington. Next to Marlene is Phyllis Kahn, still in the legislature. She was part of that class of 1972. Phyllis deserves all kinds of feminist accolades as the sponsor of the state version of the federal Title IX legislation to bring about more gender equity in women's athletics in state schools. Next to Phyllis is Linda Berglund, whom you might not recognize from that picture because her appearance changed quite a bit over the years, but Linda was for 38 years in the Minnesota legislature, Minnesota's leading voice on health matters, health policy, and was a good force for bringing about more equity for women in lots of fronts, including heading the Minnesota Council on the Economic Status of Women during some crucial years. And next to Linda is another member of that 1972 class in the Minnesota House, Mary Forsyth. I put her up to remind us that, again, this was a bipartisan thing. Mary Forsyth was a Republican and was elected in Edina for many years and brought a feminist impulse to the legislature on the Republican side as long as she was there. So those are some of my Minnesota women's movement heroes, and they are all active in the 1970s, as were these women that you see in this picture. Rosalie Wahl on the very far left. This is one of the meetings of the Minnesota Women Lawyers Group, and a number of these women around this table eventually become judges. The Minnesota Women Lawyers Group was founded in 1972, and its sole aim initially was to bring about some gender integration of the Minnesota judicial branch of government. In 1972, and I think it was still true in 1977 when Rosalie gets appointed to the Supreme Court, there were no women district judges in Minnesota that had been appointed by a governor, period. There was one woman district judge in Hennepin County, Suzanne Sedgwick, who had arrived by election, a Republican from Edina. Otherwise, there had been several gubernatorial appointed municipal judges. In those years that we had municipal courts and district courts, there had been several municipal judges, including, I learned recently, Rick Nolan's aunt, the congressman from the 8th District, had a very politically active aunt who was a municipal judge in Little Falls. But otherwise, there were no women district judges. So this was an area that women who were involved in the law really wanted to see changed, and so did the cause of getting more gender integration in the courts becomes a major kind of a focal point for the state's women's movement. So much so that when Rudy Perpich becomes governor in December of 1976, one of the first things he does is goes off to meet with the new and powerful, then seemingly very powerful DFL Feminist Caucus, a group that had a lot of powerful personalities in it. And the question that they put to him in front of reporters and everybody else is there assembled is, will you appoint women judges? And he said yes, and they didn't believe him. So when a Supreme Court opening arrives, some of those same leaders, Corinne Horbel and Cynthia Kitlinski, camped out literally at the governor's residence the night before the appointment was to be made, convinced that the last people to have an audience with the governor would get their choice made, and they were sure he needed that kind of encouragement to put a woman on the bench. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Rudy Perpich becomes a real hero for women in Minnesota in lots of governmental circles, including the court. He announced the appointment for Rosalie was announced at a one and only Minnesota Women's Conference at St. Cloud University on June 3rd, 1977. And I can tell you a little personal story about that. It was this one and only unusual meeting that had been mandated by Congress and money provided by Congress to have every state could have a meeting like this to be the run-up of the UN Year of the Woman process that was going to happen the following year. A delegation was to be elected to a national women's conference that was going to happen that fall in Houston. And the editors of the Minneapolis Tribune, not quite knowing what to do with this, said, oh, we'll send the kid. And so they sent me. I was 24 years old, quite new to the Star Tribune. I think I'd been there about a year and a half. But I had been covering religion and abortion politics were a thing that came together. And so I was interested in all of this, and I was in the room when Joan Grow announced this appointment. Rudy didn't do it because he was at that very moment giving the commencement address at his son's high school in Hibbing, where his son was the valedictorian. So he had a personal higher calling, but he allowed Joan Grow, the state's then only female statewide elected official, to make this announcement. And the room erupts. It was pandemonium, and I sat there thinking, oh my goodness, all these people in this room know who Rosalie Wahl is, and I don't. And I have to write the story. and so I felt sheepish and embarrassed and realized afterwards that most of them didn't know who she was either. It was just that there had been such a head of steam built within the women's movement, such a consciousness that we have a problem with our judiciary. The fact that he would appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, and that same night he announced the appointment of a couple of women to the district court level. This was breakthrough stuff. No governor had ever done this before. And it was at a time when there was a real felt concern that the courts were not fair to women. Rosalie, after she gets on the court, feels that way too and begins to do something about it. But first she had to stand for election in 1978. It was a mean, nasty election. And I won't say too much about that given the lateness of the hour here, but Chapter 7. It's a mean, nasty election, and Rosalie finally prevails because the establishment thinks that her opponents have gone too far in questioning her qualifications and distorting her record. Rosalie spent 17 years on the court, and she became the most visible justice I think we've ever had. She gave talks all over the state. Whenever I'm in a group of folks who are of a certain age, I'll say, did you ever hear Rosalie give a talk? And it's amazing how many hands go up. Many, many people in the state felt that they knew her personally and felt a kinship with her as she would share a little bit of her story and talk about her desire for the courts to function with more fairness and equity for women. So in end of 1986, she and then Chief Justice Doug Amdahl, a Republican, cook up the notion that there should be a task force. A few other states, 4 or 5 other states had done this, to make recommendations about how we could make the courts function better for women. The Gender Fairness Task Force, which gives its final report in 1989, is a landmark. A real major sea change for the courts, making more than 100 recommendations, some of them for legislation, for changes especially in the areas of family law, but many of them changes in legal procedures, addressing the discrimination that this task force heard about in an amazing series of hearings around the state. Discrimination from the lowliest level of people accused of crime up to the few women then on the bench who were facing all kinds of unusual requests and attitudes on the part of the men that they encountered. Task force was considered such a triumph that Rosalie was talked into heading a second task force on racial bias, and she went into that with some trepidation, knowing that racial bias would be a tougher nut to crack, and indeed it has proven to be. But that task force was notable for calling for a richer collection of data around race in the courts than was done at that time. So now at least we're able to better see what some of those problems have been. Rosalie retires in 1994. And when she retires, Minnesota by then has the only female majority state Supreme Court in the country. Since then, there have been 1 or 2 other states that have had that achievement. That's the handiwork of Rudy Perpich. His last day in office, in January of 1991, he appoints the 4th woman to the court. It was something he was very proud of having done. That was sort of the high water mark for the second wave in Minnesota. By the 1990s, about 1/3 of the members of the Minnesota legislature are women. And if you read the document that Y suggested that we look at from the Minnesota Foundation, Women's Foundation, you see that we're still about 1/3 female in the legislature. That hasn't changed much. By the 1990s, more than half of the students at Minnesota's 2 big professional schools, law and medical school, were women, and that's still true. By the 1990s, Minnesota boasted the highest share of women in the workforce in the nation, especially among women with young children. That is still almost true. I think we're 3rd highest last time I checked. And yet, not too much has changed in the workplace for a lot of women. A majority of low-income workers in the state are still female. A majority of workers without paid sick leave are female. I've pulled out that stat from the stuff that Y asked us to look at because I thought it was impressive. 40% of Minnesota women workers overall do not have access to paid sick days. In 2014, the legislature enacted something called the Minnesota Women's Economic Security Act, a breakthrough piece of legislation. National folks told me it's the best piece of feminist legislation passed in any state in 25 years. And it increased the time off that must be allotted by larger employers, not smaller ones, larger employers for the arrival of a new child from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, unpaid, which means it's not available to many people. That's been what has passed for progress. Caregiving is a risky activity in the workplace, and I'm screwing this up here. Caregiving for many employees, and during the lobbying effort for that Minnesota Women's Economic Security Act in 2014, it struck me how vigorously the business community fought the proposal to introduce caregiving as one of the things on which workers could not be discriminated in the workplace. We have had for some years a rather robust statute about anti-discrimination statute in the workplace. It goes back to Y's friend and my friend Elmer L. Anderson in the 1950s. In fact, our first Fair Employment Practices Act was something Elmer sponsored in 1955. We, over the years, have enlarged that to include protections against discrimination for a variety of reasons, and the proposal was in 2014 to add caregiving to that list because there was good testimony from a number of women about how they were denied pay raises and promotions and opportunities in the workplace because there was an awareness on the part of their employers that they were involved in caregiving for elder relatives, and the business community fought like crazy, and that was not included in that statute. So, I think, as I mentioned, a third wave is coming, and I think a third wave is coming for a number of reasons. There's a generational thing going on. Some of you, I think, look like you might be in the millennial generation. The millennials are now bigger and more numerous in this state and in the country than the baby boomers are. We can look back 50 years and see what changes happened in this society when the baby boomers, this big, young generation, arrived. That's my generation. But the baby boomers' kids are poised, I think, to make similar big changes. We are facing in this country a workforce shortage, and in Minnesota it's already here, and it's going to be keenly felt. And the desire of employers to keep more people in the workforce, especially young women, young parents, typically young women are the ones who have stepped out of the workforce because of caregiving responsibilities for children. A desire is upon us, I think, to keep those people in the workforce for the sake of our economy, and that will be an impetus for a third wave. I also think that the social media tools of organizing will enable the folks who would like to make changes in our institutions to find each other and rally in new ways. Organizing is still what's crucial. So what might the third wave learn from the second wave and from Rosalie Wahl? I was struck as I read the stories and heard the stories of women who lived through that period that there was an easy sense of sisterhood, of finding each other and seeing each other as allies. I hope that social media gives today's people who desire change an opportunity to make similarly strong connections across all kinds of geographic, partisan, other kinds of lines. I think it takes optimism and a sense that history is on your side to persist in this kind of cause. And Rosalie possessed that kind of optimism as an act of will. She had so many setbacks in her life, so many things that didn't go well. So many times the men in her life let her down one way or another, and yet she was incredibly confident that history was very much on their side and that a better day was coming. One of her speeches after a rather major election setback, she said, "We will not give 1 inch to despair." That was the attitude with which she pursued so many things. There was a naive attitude in those years that if we would simply put women in leadership posts, sprinkle them in strategic places around our society, that change would come that would be beneficial for all. And I think we're a little less naive about that. You remember in 2008 there was a sense that, boy, we'll elect an African-American president and life will be better for black people in this country, and we see how that maybe didn't work out quite like that. So I think we have a more sophisticated sense today that putting women in leadership posts is a necessary but not sufficient ingredient to change, and that organizing, again, at a grassroots level, so that, again, we can see a grassroots movement like the one in the 1960s and 70s for gender equity, that's what makes the difference. I threw up, in time before last when I gave this talk, this notion of finding a wellspring that sustains your ideals, and I think I was speaking to a church group at the time, but I always see some heads nod among older people when I talk about this. Rosalie was able to overcome a lot because she had found in her young adult years a way to renew her sense of idealism and be willing to try again, to pick up from defeat. For her, that was the Quaker faith. She was involved in the Society of Friends and helped found several of the Society of Friends organizations in this city all her life, and was a faithful participant and a leader in those groups, and really found a great deal of renewal in that. She was also a poet, and a pretty good one, and a lover of nature, and would retreat into nature and to the opportunity to write poetry and renew herself. Part of the work of adulthood for all of us, I think, is to find what it is for us that can keep us idealistic and renew our strength for the next venture in change making. So those are some of the thoughts I have about Rosalie. She died in July of 2013, I had just finished the book that I wrote about her, and I was not able to give her the finished product, and I feel bad about that. All the books I've done with and about other Minnesotans, that's I think the only one that where the Grim Reaper got her before I could do that, and I feel bad about that. But she's, I think, become more of a touchstone for more people maybe after her death than she had been in her last years. She was, after leaving the court, she was in retirement for almost 20 years, and during that time she was involved in the peace movement here locally. She would still give speeches while she could, but toward the end her health failed, both physical and mental health, sad to say. I was really fortunate to be able to interview her for this book. I was approached to do the book and was told, if you want to do this, get over to see her right now. And so I was given leave from what I was working on and was able to have 4 good sessions with her, and I really am glad for that. I brought along some copies of the book, by the way. In case you don't have a copy and would like to have one, I have some from my personal stash with me. I'll sell them for $15. That's a little discount off of retail, and I'd be glad to do that today. So those are that's my Rosalie Wahl talk. And it's been fun to me to see how receptive Minnesota audiences are to the notion that there's a third wave coming.